It began with restless nights and constant itching. Noah would wake up covered in red welts, convinced he had bed bugs. His father, Oscar, pored over countless articles online, learning everything there was to know about these nocturnal pests. Desperate to find a solution, he sought an expert's professional help. But once the expert saw those bed bugs, his face turned pale and he said, "These are not ordinary bed bugs. We need to leave your room now." Oscar and his wife weren't too pleased with all this chaos in their house, especially with their little boy Noah around. They tried to discuss the evacuation, but soon they realized there was no room for arguing. This was dead serious, and it was in their best interest to leave as quickly as they could. Noah's parents couldn't believe it and demanded an explanation from the expert right away. There wasn't even time to pack their bags. They just needed to leave as soon as they could. But what was so dangerous? Why was the expert in such a panic, and why did they leave the house instantly? But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Like any other young kid, Noah was afraid of what may or may not be hiding under his bed. For that reason, he checked under his bed every morning. But he did not see anything under his bed, but he did see something on it. Noah was shocked and immediately ran downstairs. He yelled for his parents, but they didn't immediately respond. When he finally got their attention, he told them about his discovery. They didn't believe him at first, but when they saw the fear in his eyes, they went upstairs with him. Oscar thought he was dealing with a familiar problem here, but they looked slightly different than bed bugs. He slowly stretched out his hand to touch it, but Noah yelled, "Dad, no! Don't do that! You don't know if it's safe." Oscar and Hilly decided to call an expert, not only to reassure Noah, but also to have the insects removed as soon as possible. The expert arrived quickly. Less than 15 minutes after they had made the call, he was already knocking on their door. When the expert heard the description of the find, he was shocked. But he didn't explain why. He just asked if he could go upstairs right now because there was little time. The expert stepped courageously into the room and carefully looked at the bed with a flashlight. Without saying anything, he kept checking the bed for several minutes while the family waited in suspense. They craved answers, or at least more clarity, but suddenly they heard a loud sound. The expert was screaming in horror. He had just been so quiet and concentrated, doing his job. And now he suddenly screamed as if he were facing his greatest fear. Oscar squeezed Noah close, telling him everything was going to be okay. But why did the expert scream like that? What had happened in the bed? The family waited for the expert to come out of the room and explain what was going on. But he didn't do that. He stayed there, leaving the rest in the dark. The expert finally opened the bedroom door, but avoided eye contact with the family. This is absurd, Oscar thought. He lost his temper and walked over to the man, demanding that he at least say what he saw and what made him scream. But the expert walked away, snapping at Oscar, "I need backup! Leave me alone!" Hilly agreed with him. However, she was a bit calmer than Oscar and kindly asked the expert if he could tell them what was going on and if they could do anything to help. But his answer would only make them even more worried. The expert preferred Hilly's approach, and he finally looked at her. He clearly made an effort to speak to her and Oscar, looking worriedly in Noah's direction. Hilly wondered, these could not just be case on simple bed bugs, right? Meanwhile, the expert finally called for backup. Oscar, Hilly, and Noah were asked to wait in the living room until the others arrived. They hesitantly obliged, but they wondered what the expert actually meant by backup. Did he ring his boss or one of his colleagues? And what would happen when they arrived? Not much later, the backup actually arrived. It was a whole team. They hardly paid attention to the family and only briefly nodded to little Noah. They went straight to his bedroom, where they carefully began the preparations. The operation had begun, and it wasn't going to be an easy one. Men in white suits filled Noah's room. Oscar and Hilly stood by their son's door and watched in horror as the men tore up the room. They pushed all the furniture aside and gathered around Noah's bed, lifting the blankets carefully. The family could hear the men murmur under their masks, and they sounded very serious. But as soon as the bed was pulled apart, the experts' colleagues were also shocked. Oscar, Hilly, and Noah could now also clearly see the red bed bugs on the sheets. There were many more than he first expected. They still wondered what was so special about it. Some of them left with samples of the red bugs, and others stayed and taped off Noah's room. Eventually, the team decided to call the police. Oscar was shocked. Was it that bad? Were the police really needed? Not long after, the whole house was full of cops and scientists. Oscar, Hilly, and little Noah tried to get closer, yet they still couldn't hear anything because the experts and the police officers were whispering. This was clearly information they could not share directly with the family. Then Oscar saw a strange reaction on one of the officers' faces. He saw how his eyes were wide open from shock. This officer clearly heard some unexpected news, and it showed on his face. Oscar firmly demanded an answer from the officers, but as he spoke to them, all the police officers did something Oscar never saw coming. They stepped back. With a surprised look on their face, they said, "Sir, stay there. You need to lay on the ground and don't move." What is going on? Oscar thought. He slowly put his hands in the air and got down on his knees. Was Oscar being arrested? Why would they do something like that? He was put into a police car, and they also put Noah and his wife into another police car. After a few minutes, Oscar noticed a large group in white suits approaching and entering the house. Finally, someone informed him, "We need to take you and your family with us, sir." What the heck? Was he being arrested? As the car drove away, Oscar noticed that the driver was not a police officer. It was one of those people in white suits. After a 2-hour drive, they arrived at their destination, an airport. Suddenly, he was escorted onto a waiting helicopter and taken away. "Where is my son? Where are my son and wife? Where are you taking me?" he asked. His voice was barely louder than the sound of the helicopter's propeller. Oscar looked out of the helicopter, trying to recognize the land below, but it was in vain. What was this place? Suddenly, he felt the helicopter descend. Soon after, Oscar arrived at a base camp that seemed like a military camp. But there was something different about it. As soon as the helicopter landed, another team of white-suited people arrived and grabbed Oscar by the arms. They whisked him away into a nearby building where they locked him up in a cell. The stark, sterile surroundings made him feel isolated and trapped. 2 hours later, a man entered Oscar's cell, again fully packed with a white suit. He introduced himself as Alex, who claimed to work for a secret forces team. He apologized for the situation, but insisted their actions had been necessary. "I have to tell you something." Oscar's heart raced as the words sunk in. He yelled, "What? What? What?" Was something happening to Noah? Then Alex's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "It's about your son, seriously ill." Oscar's mind was racing with questions as he tried to process the news about his son's sudden illness. Another man entered the room and conducted a few tests on Oscar. A long and dreadful hour later, they received the results. And, thankfully, Oscar was not infected by the bed bugs. He was relieved and eager to finally see his son again. He prayed to God that he would be okay. They told him his wife, Hilly, was still waiting on the test results, and if she were to be negative too, she would be joining him in their son's room. Alex said, leading Oscar to his son's room. "Are you ready to see him?" Oscar waited for a few seconds. As Oscar walked into the room, he was struck with disbelief at the sight of his son lying in bed. He was hooked to a machine, and fluid dripped through a tube. The question that kept haunting him was whether he would pull through this ordeal. But Alex assured him she would. Alex continued, "This illness is fairly new, and there have only been 3 cases known in the world. We're still testing various possible cures, but one really stands out." He paused and looked at Oscar. Alex put his hand on Oscar's shoulder. "You do not have to worry." Alex suggested that if Oscar's blood was given to his son, his blood cells might adjust with Oscar's good blood cells, and it could possibly help save him. But before they could start the transfusion, they had to be sure their blood was compatible. After they successfully filled the bag with Oscar's blood, they entered Noah's room and hung the bag of blood to let it drip into his vein. Finally, Hilly arrived. She wore a white suit, just like the rest, but her presence meant she tested negative for the virus as well, and that was reassuring. Oscar was eager to know more about the shell, and Alex finally agreed to tell him everything. But on one condition, he had to sign a contract promising not to divulge the information to anyone. And without hesitation, Oscar immediately agreed. The bed turned out to have an investigation of mutated bed bugs, a very rare new species that could have a somewhat poisonous bite. But regardless, this was the first case of those bugs being seen in this country, and that is why such extreme precautions were taken. About a month ago, he had a friend come over from Brazil for a night. He had been deep in the rainforest just before that and could maybe have had some seeds stuck in his shoes. He slept in Noah's room for the night, so that would explain how the infestation had started there. He asked for an update on her condition, and the doctors had good news for him. Noah was doing a lot better. Oscar was immensely relieved to learn that the blood transfusion had worked, as his son had finally woken up from his deep sleep. The next day, they asked if they could finally go home, but Alex told them that was a difficult situation because their house was still in lockdown and needed to be thoroughly cleaned. Instead, they provided a temporary home for Oscar and his family where they could stay until it was time for them to go home.